The history of African Americans is the history of America. The history of African Americans begins with the arrival of Africans to North America in the 16th and 17th century in the form of slaves. Roughly 388,000 landed in North America who were sold to white colonists, primarily to work on cash crop plantations. By the time of the 1775 American Revolutionary War, there were many African American soldiers who were fighting on behalf of the original 13 colonies against the British. Roughly 20% of the American population was of African descent at this time, and most of them were slaves. After the United States got its independence, the northern states gradually abolished the slavery. However, the southern United States, which had an economy dependent on plantations operation by slave labor, basically entrenched the slave system and even expanded it during the westward expansion of the United States. This was the time when numerous enslaved African Americans escaped into the northern free states and Canada via the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman are two abolitionists and former slaves who worked tirelessly against slavery. Disputes over slavery between the Union and the Southern Confederate States led to the outbreak of the American Civil War in the 1800s. 178,000 African Americans served on the Union side, which won over the Southern Confederate States. And this changed the lives of African Americans in this country forever. During the war, President Abraham Lincoln issued the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. After the war, African Americans living in the South were granted equal rights with their white neighbors. However, a lot of white opposition to these advancements still remained, and this led to most African Americans living in the South to be disenfranchised, and a system of racial segregation known as the Jim Crow laws were passed in the southern states. Beginning in the early 20th century, in response to poor economic conditions, segregation, and lynchings, over 6 million primarily rural African Americans migrated out of the South to other regions of the United States in search of opportunity. Civil rights movement to overturn the discrimination and racism against African Americans in the 1950s and 60s persuaded the federal government to outlaw this racial discrimination, and eventually President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law in 1964, thanks to the African American civil rights activists Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, alongside many other influential leaders. Since then, there's been no looking back for the African American community in the United States. Currently, there are about 47 million African Americans in the United States. That's 14% of the total population of the USA. And African Americans have made major contributions to the United States in every field, including literature, military, politics, entertainment like cinema and music. From Frederick Douglass to Du Bois to the Nobel laureate Toni Morrison, many African Americans contributed to the field of literature. The first African American U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, and the first Black woman astronaut ever in space, Mae Jemison. When it comes to sports, African Americans have made a great impact. Be it the boxing legend Muhammad Ali, or the legendary boxer Mike Tyson, or the king of golf Tiger Woods, or the tennis princesses Venus and Serena Williams, or the basketball legend himself Michael Jordan. And by the way, speaking of basketball, the whole NBA basketball sport is absolutely dominated by African Americans. African Americans fought all U.S. wars ferociously. General Colin Powell was the Secretary of State for President George W. Bush during his first term, and after Colin Powell came Condoleezza Rice as Secretary of State during President George W. Bush's second term in office, and she was also African American. The current Vice President, Kamala Harris, is also African American, and of course, we all know about our 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama. Coming to music, the African American impact is of a lion's share. You have the king of pop music, Michael Jackson, the queen of soul, Aretha Franklin, or the jazz legend, Louis Armstrong. And Academy Award-winning actors Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman, they have made such an immense contribution to Hollywood. And we all know how big of an impact Oprah Winfrey made through her TV shows. And lastly, my man, the one and only Mr. Steve Harvey. The African American contribution to America is huge, and February is the month to recognize and celebrate all of these legends. To know more about the history of Black History Month, please click the video in the description. Thanks so much for watching. Love you, Akash.